Edgar Cayce's Planetary Sojourn in Mars. Part 2. For Mars represents and is the influence that makes for urges within the innate forces of anger, madness, wrath, strength, endurance. In Mars we find anger, animosity, covetousness becoming the influence or force for detrimental activity in the experience. In Mars we find anger, rashness, the daredevil expression and activity that has been a part of the entity's experience. As from the Mars influence, oft there has been allowed anger and madness to control in the experience, in varied directions. Madness and anger from Mars have deprived the entity of opportunities, or have offered opportunities, will offer opportunities. And what the entity does about those influences makes or mars the experiences as in relation to same. In Mars there have been adverse as well as constructive influences, in that angers, wrath, pettiness at times have been a part of the entity's experience. In Mars we find at times anger, or not just having what's wanted at the moment upsets the entity. Curb this. Know that all comes to him who puts his trust in the all-powerful influence of love and harmony, the real poem of life, and then works like thunder for same. For we will find from Mars not only those inclinations for anger, madness, ire to arise, but also the inclination for the inventiveness, the daringness, as will be seen from the experiences of the entity in the earthly sojourns in other fields of activity. We also find in Mars anger, self-indulgence, becoming at times stumbling blocks to the entity. It is true, however, that an individual who has no temper is in almost as bad a fix as one who having one does not control it. Mars. Anger, wrath, madness at times have been the experiences that have caused those temperamental influences which have arisen in the entity's experience during this particular sojourn. In the influence as seen from Mars, brings those that, in a manner, the entity has conquered, or at least allayed within self, of wrath, contempt, and of littleness. These have been innate from experiences, and the entity must war, as it were, against such. In the urge through Mars forces brings that at times of the temper that has been subdued in part through that of self's will to apply that of love and forbearance, rather than that as would appear in the urge to enact at that time. In Mars we find there have been periods when wrath, anger, even turmoils have been and are a portion of the experience. And as to whether these become constructive or destructive depends upon how the entity uses or applies such, or it depends upon the will, which is the birthright of every soul. From the influences in Mars, as well as Jupiter, we find indicated rather anger or madness or wrath on the part of others more than of self. For while the entity has not gotten to where it is not able to be angry, we find that it has attained to that position where it may be angry and yet sin not. In those influences from Mars we will find that anger at times in the activities of others about the entity may bring some distressing disturbances. These are those things in which the entity may become sullen, morose, or in the mullygrubs as it might be termed by some. These are only disturbances within self. And when these arise, know that thy relationships with the creative forces within are looking for self-indulgence and self-glory rather than for the influences that are thy life itself. We find from Mars that the entity has a very good temper. This isn't bad temper, but a good temper. One without a temper is in very bad shape, but one who can't control his temper is in still worse shape. The entity is one, then, who has learned to hold the temper, and yet not be entirely suppressed in doing so, or by the needs of such. Rather being able to gain from same, through the very virtue of patience and long-suffering, which has been and is the experience of the entity through this particular sojourn. In Mars we find where anger and wrath has made for great variations. For those that are of high temper are very well provided it is not allowed to become a stumbling stone. Use such rather in thy experience to learn patience, understanding, grace and mercy, and not as a manner of giving expression of that which produces hate and hardships in the experiences of any. From Mars we find the associations with things where conditions of war, of anger, of wrath on the part of the individuals, groups or masses, do bring and have had, and will have great influences upon the activities of the entity. They that have no temper are worth little. They that have not a control of their temper are worth less. In Mars we find anger and madness, that has often aroused or brought great differences of opinions, and their expressions that have made for divisions among thy fellows, as well as in thy friendships and associations. It is well that anger and its ability for expression be existent, but woe indeed to those who allow same to become stumbling blocks, and to cause hate, malice and injustice to be dealt in any manner to their fellow men. One that can get as mad as the most, and becomes very determined in self. These are necessary, yet if these are not controlled by the entity they may become hard to deal with. And the ability to control must be instilled in the unfolding mind of the entity. These are indicated in mind and in Mars, and will also bring strength and virility, and a strong body after those periods of the unfoldment have come. We find in Mars the anger, the wrath, that finds its level, even as does water in its material consciousness. And as such is the mother of strife, of vice, yea, and the purifier also of that as may be assimilated in spiritual consciousness, it is the purging spirit in the experience of man in the world today. In strife, in war, in greediness, in hate, and all is a part of thy material consciousness.